Good morning. My name is Daniel Suryadharma. I'm a research fellow at the ADB Institute in Tokyo. We're very happy to have Professor Fernando Reimers today to give the featured speaker webinar. So Professor Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice of International Development, International Education, my apologies, and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative at Harvard University. His research and teaching focus on understanding how to educate children and youth so they can thrive in the 21st century. Professor Reimers was a member of the UNESCO Commission that wrote the report on Reimagining Our Futures Together, a new social contract for education. He has developed sustainable development goals aligned curricula in use in many schools globally and led numerous comparative studies examining COVID-19's educational consequences and options to sustain educational opportunity. So Professor Reimers will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we open for Q&A. Please, you can type your questions during his talk, and then we will try to get to as many of them after the talk. So Professor Reimers, please, the floor is yours.
Daniel, thank you very much for the invitation and for the kind introduction. And thank you all so much for joining us in what is the evening in Boston, but I believe it's morning for you in the East. So I'm going to present some ideas and some findings of my own research and the research of my colleagues in the Global Initiative on the impact of COVID on education, for the purpose of setting the stage so that we can have a discussion about these findings. I'm going to share my slides at this point to support my presentation. I hope you can see them now. And I'm going to call this presentation Learning from the Educational Effects of the COVID-19 Pandemic. And the basic argument I want to submit is that the pandemic is an opportunity for us to think differently about education. But much of the educational research available so far is not really supporting different thinking. In fact, we may be risking losing the opportunity to learn from this significant disruption in ways that can help us reimagine education. And let me try to explain that, structuring my presentation in 5 sections. The first one is I'm going to just make the case for why it is crucial that we learn about the implications of the pandemic for education. Then I'm going to present the stylized facts of what is best known about the effects of the pandemic on education. But I'm also then going to talk about what is it that we should know about the effects of the pandemic, but know less about, the silver linings. And then I want to conclude outlining what I see as the main educational risks of the pandemic, as well as the opportunities. So why is learning about the implications of the pandemic so important? Essentially for 2 reasons. Number one, because the pandemic represents the single biggest global educational disruption to public education on record. And therefore, it's an opportunity to learn at a practical level, what did that mean for learners and teachers, but also what are going to be the consequences for them. But at a theoretical level, it's also an opportunity to basically understand what are the contributions of schools and of education programs to learning. One of the enduring questions in education is, to what extent do schools have any autonomy from the larger social structures in which they are embedded? In other words, what is the contribution of social factors expressed through home conditions, community conditions, social conditions more generally, versus factors that can be influenced by education policy? Well, the pandemic is an opportunity to examine that. And so we need to know how it impacted students and with what results for them. And of course, at a practical level, how it is that we're going to remediate the losses that it may have generated. But we also need to know how it impacted education systems, their capacity, their priorities, the kinds of things that they were working on, with what consequences. And then we need to hopefully course correct and learn. Let me illustrate what I mean. Prior to March 2020, the main thrust of the Global Education Innovation Initiative, which I lead at Harvard, was investigating how to transform public education systems so they did a better job providing students the opportunities to build the full range of skills that they needed to participate in societies where the bar for participation was increasing. So that meant higher order cognitive skills, as well as interpersonal and intrapersonal skills. And our previous studies had shown that this notion of developing 21st century skills, this notion of broadening the goals of the curriculum, was slowly but surely taking hold on the policy agenda. I think it's reasonable to ask whether the pandemic displaced those goals that were driving education systems um, towards more basic goals, more foundational goals, essentially fundamental literacy and fundamental math, both because the concern over loss on those basic capacities is so great that it might lead some to think that this is not a time to pursue expansive ambitions for education, but in fact to conserve the most basic things. But clearly, if that is the impact that the pandemic is having on systems, that means the pandemic has had a conservative effect in education systems, in effect setting them back in the priorities that were slowly shaping the policy agenda. The second main reason why it's important to understand the educational implications of the pandemic is because the pandemic is only, even though it is the largest single disruption to public education on record, it is one instance of a larger type of disruptions that have been ongoing for some time and that we can expect to continue. And those are disruptions caused by the interruption of schooling. Very common are the interruptions of, and increasingly common, the interruptions of schooling caused by natural disasters, many of them induced by climate change, but also the interruption of schooling resulting from civil conflict and from wars, from violence, or from other health-related epidemics. And so it's important to understand how resilient are education systems to those disruptions. To what extent can we develop the capacity in students, as well as teachers and systems, to continue to teach in spite of disruptions that we can expect are going to be a feature of our lives, and at least for those disruptions that are a function of climate-related events, increasingly common. And we need to know how the needs created by those disruptions, the needs on the livelihood of people, the economic needs, the social needs, the political needs, what those mean for education systems. So for example, we're to think about the disruptions caused by conflict, intra or interstate conflict. Obviously, there are implications for education systems in terms of helping students build the capacities that can help them interrupt the reproduction of conflict. But we could argue the same for climate-related events, in that the necessity to develop the skills for mitigation, adaptation, and reversal of climate change has direct implications for education systems, for competencies that need to be built in education systems. So I think for these two main reasons, because it is the biggest global disruption and because we're going to continue to see disruptions, it's very important that we develop a full and complete appreciation of the effects of the pandemic. But that means that there is a range of questions worth examining. The most obvious are, well, did the students lose opportunities to learn, either because they lost access to school or they were unable to learn in the manner in which the pandemic, in which education systems made it possible to learn during the pandemic. But we need to know more than whether access diminished or learning diminished. We need to understand why. We need to understand the mechanisms. And I'm going to come in a moment to this point because we have growing evidence on learning loss and on the impact of the pandemic on access, but sadly, very little of that evidence actually tells us anything about the mechanisms. And we know that because the pandemic impacted demand conditions, home conditions, as well as supply conditions, schools, trying to disentangle those two is critical if we're going to be able to conclude anything about the resilience of education systems and what it is that education systems need to do to sustain educational opportunity in the face of future disruptions. But there are other questions that are worth examining. And one is, did students learn anything from the pandemic? Did students learn anything that they wouldn't have otherwise learned because of the disruption? And how did they learn that? What were the mechanisms through which they learned it? For example, many students spend more time at home independently, had more opportunities for independent work. So is there something that they learned from that about how to learn, about how to pursue their interests? But we also need to know, how did the pandemic impact the capacity of education systems and the progress that education systems? Most places around the world, education systems were not sitting still. They were working on a variety of policies and programs. And the implementation of those programs and policies was disrupted because of the pandemic. With what effects? Did, did the pandemic improve the capacity of education systems in any way? Was there any kind of innovation, either at the pedagogical level or at the organizational or managerial level? This is the question about the silver linings. And then lastly, what overall impact did the pandemic have on the education agenda in terms of the goals worth pursuing, the means to advance those goals, and overall financing of education? And I want to suggest that if we think that the pandemic requires that we answer questions, this breadth of questions, in fact, we've only begun to answer questions that belong in the first of the 5 categories that I address here. So what is it that is best known at the moment, 3 years into the pandemic, about the effects of the pandemic on education? I want to suggest that the stylized facts are that, of course, students lost opportunities to learn. We now have studies that document, for the most part, and in a few countries, what are the levels of knowledge and skills on a very narrow range of outcomes, for the most part, literacy and mathematics, where the current cohort of students are in a couple of grades by comparison to where previous cohorts of students before the pandemic were. So essentially, we're talking about learning not gained. In even fewer cases, do we have information on where students are relative to where they themselves were prior to the pandemic with comparable assessments. We know that for very, very few cases, but we do not know the mechanisms. And for the most part, this is because the research that has been conducted has followed very much of a black box approach, in some cases at a national level or at the state level, but not really taking into account what was done to sustain educational opportunity and relating variability of any sort across schools, for example, in terms of the implementation of those arrangements, or relating learning loss, for example, to the extent to which students were able to engage with those opportunities. So what we know is kind of the sum total of what everything that was done during the pandemic produced, or of the loss that it produced. And we also know in some cases something about dropout, students dropout, which is to say, not very much, and certainly not knowledge that was not anticipated, as I'm going to show, in March of 2020, before any data were collected. We also know that the impact was greater on marginalized children. And as I mentioned, most of the research looks at a very, very narrow range of academic outcomes. Now, most of these findings are really confirmatory of effects that were anticipated by education authorities. And it's unclear what the policy implications are beyond trying to remediate the learning loss. So in terms of advancing knowledge that can help us build more resilient education systems, there isn't very much there, other than telling us that the systems that we had were not resilient. But I think an important question that we should ask of those studies is, so what is the counterfactual that these studies are operating is? Is the counterfactual a world without a pandemic, as if we had a choice over the matter? Or is the counterfactual the education system before the pandemic, as if that education system was adequate by any measure. And I think that both of these counterfactuals deserve a little bit more consideration. Now, in March of 2020, with colleagues at the OECD, we did something very simple. We administered a survey to education authorities in close to 200 countries. And in that survey, we asked them a few questions about this was the second week after the World Health Organization had declared COVID a global pandemic. And we asked them a range of questions about their priorities, the challenges that they anticipated in pursuing the priorities, and what they anticipated were going to be the results of the pandemic. Now, remember, March 2020, we don't have a vaccine. We don't know when we're going to have a vaccine. We don't even know how long these closures are. Governments begin to close schools in an attempt to stop the transmission of the virus, but it's unclear how long this is going to last. However, what is striking with hindsight is how well educational administrators predicted what the research that has been conducted about the effects of the pandemic has now confirmed. Yes, with greater precision, with more or less sophisticated methodologies, but the big picture is that we really haven't learned anything that education administrators did not anticipate back in March 2020. And that should cause us to examine whether we are pursuing the research agenda that we need to be pursuing, whether that research agenda is complete, or when in fact what it is giving us is confirmatory evidence of things that were known back in March of 2020. And so, for example, when these administrators were asked to mention what were the most critical issues that they face, at the top, for most of them, was to ensure the continuity of academic learning for students, which we now know it was impossible to do. To provide professional support to teachers, to ensure the well-being of teachers, to support in particular those students who didn't have the skills for independent study during the crisis, to ensure the well-being of students, to support parents so they could do a better job supporting student learning. So these areas of concern to administrators, in fact, are the areas that research shows should have been of concern. When those administrators were asked, how challenging would it be to, in the context of the pandemic and given the measures that they had, to address the following priorities? Ensure the continuity of academic learning was at the top. Most of those administrators knew this was going to be very challenging. Supporting the students who lack the skills for independent study, supporting the parents so they could do a better job supporting their students, ensuring the integrity of assessment during student learning. Again, nothing new. Administrators knew that these were going to be very challenging things to do. When they were asked to respect to the plans that they're beginning to have in place, what was challenging? At the top, the lack of technological infrastructure, addressing students' emotional health, achieving the right balance between on-screen and off-screen activities, lack of availability of parents to support the students. So in many ways, we could have taken those answers collected in that survey of March 2020 as a way to assess the readiness of the school system, the resiliency of the school system for this shock, which I suppose if there is one implication, if we wanted to do something to build more resilient education systems, we could ask education authorities these questions, and we could do it not at a national level, but at a subnational level, identifying the regions that need the most help. With my colleagues in the Global Education Initiative, we conducted one of the very first comparative studies, examining towards December up to December of 2020, what impact the pandemic had had on education. And I'm going to, in a moment, summarize the findings. The book is an open access publication. It can be freely downloaded on the link that you see here. We're right now finishing a book, which is an update of this one, that looks at what has happened 3 years in, with an emphasis not on this black box approach of before and after, but of really understanding the sequence of decisions made by governments and how they were implemented and with what results, with an emphasis in understanding the dynamics of education, policymaking, and management 3 years into the pandemic. But to go back to that first study, what were the key findings? And by design, we selected a range of countries that were different in terms of per capita income, in terms of institutional challenges, and so on. You see on the screen the countries that we studied. And what we found is that in the first year of the pandemic, clearly the pandemic had impacted education through at least six channels. One, it had created an austerity in governments. If you remember, in some governments, there was, Latin America, for example, an economic recession, a severe economic recession at the beginning. This has eased out since, in some cases, because countries have adopted measures to stimulate fiscal spending. But of course, we can anticipate that over time, this is going to either increase service and debt payments or eventually simply push out and maybe space out that make more gradual the impact of that recession. But there was also, of course, in that first year of the pandemic, a severe austerity in individuals because there was an increase in poverty. There was also the most obvious health impact of life loss, which impacted some communities more than others. This was still a period when vaccines were not available, December 2020. There was the other mechanism, of course, was the interruption of schools. I'm going to show in a moment for how long schools were interrupted in many places. And then there were multiplier effects of the pandemic on other challenges. These are figures collected by UNESCO, the World Bank, and other partners, I think UNICEF as well, that show for how long schools were closed, either fully or partially. The bottom line is that schools were closed for a very, very long time. In some cases, in some regions, in South Asia and Latin America, for up to 2 years. There is now emerging, I think that at the end of this month, the World Bank is going to release a new report that has up to 20 assessments of learning loss, and that show a direct correlation between duration of school closures and amount of learning loss. Again, nothing to be very surprised, confirmatory research that if you shut down schools, and if the alternative means that you have to educate kids aren't going to serve all the kids, a lot of kids are going to not learn, and they will disengage. But anyway, I guess in hindsight, the question that we should be asking is, was it necessary to close schools for so long in some communities, particularly because this wasn't always done in close coordination with public health authorities. So this was not always a response to localized epidemiological conditions. Now, what are the key lessons learned in this comparative study? Well, the main one is that the story of the impact of the pandemic on education is not a single story. In fact, that there are multiple stories depending on the country. And what the examination of this case study shows is that education policy responses matter. In particular, how long the school closures were. In some countries, they were extremely short. Singapore, Finland, for example. And as a result of that, there was less loss in those countries. In other cases, most countries in Latin America, for example, closures were very long. And as a result, there are bigger losses there. But also there were differences across countries in the extent to which the most disadvantaged students were prioritized during the pandemic. Portugal was a country that made it a central matter to their national policy response to basically test ex ante all their policies with respect to how sensitive the most vulnerable students were going to be to that policy. The other finding that these chapters show is that pre-existing conditions make a big difference. In effect, that some countries were more ready in terms of having created a technological infrastructure and helped teachers gain the digipedagogies that made online instruction possible, i.e. Finland, Singapore. And as a result, they were able to teach better remotely than the countries that hadn't made those investments. But it isn't only high-income countries that did that. Uruguay not in this original study, but one that we have studied subsequently, is a country that had made investments for over a decade, developing the infrastructure, technological infrastructure, and the capacity for most students to learn online. And as a result, they were more able to transition to remote instruction, even though there were challenges even in that context. Other findings of these a series of case studies is the importance of intersectoral coordination, particularly between health and education, and the coordination across levels of government, which the pandemic revealed in some jurisdictions, for example, Spain or the United States, was really, really deficient. The studies point also to the importance of leadership, of educational leadership, and the value of partnerships with civil society, as well as the value of cross-national cooperation. We do know that educational inequality increase. We know from these case studies, and that's because the least developed countries experience the combined effect of several mutually reinforcing challenges: the longest school closures, the lowest levels of resources and institutional capacity to mitigate learning loss, the lower levels of access to vaccines, the greatest increases in poverty, the lower effectiveness of the modalities that were deployed to continue to educate remotely, and the greatest pre-existing levels of social and educational inequality. So all these forces came together and produced a world in which educational opportunities were less equal at the end of December 2020 than they were in March of 2020. And another form of inequality has to do even with the use of technology, because the students with more resources and those who attended schools with more resources had access to uses of technology that produce higher cognitive activation, that develop higher order skills, whereas the students in more disadvantaged conditions, maybe they had access to technologies that were used to transmit content, but not very much to engage them. So to conclude, the pandemic produced a quintessential Matthew effect. And the Matthew effect, citing from the Bible, is basically that initial inequalities will be compounded. And that's what we know from the pandemic. Now, those are the stylized facts. There continues to be research essentially confirming, underscoring those things. And now some research evaluating the impact of some of the interventions that are being tried to mitigate learning loss, to remediate learning loss. But there are many things that are not really known about the effects of the pandemic, in particular about any silver linings. And I think that the questions that we should explore is, why did students in some systems not lose learning opportunities? In other words, we should be as interested in the systems, either at the national or subnational level, where we do not see learning loss, as we are in those that experience learning loss. And I think that by overemphasizing the national level, we are missing the opportunity to even identify, to explore those differences. And I'm going to give an example in a moment of what we could find if we actually looked at those systems where there was no loss. But we should also be interested in whether students learned something from the pandemic. And to my knowledge, there is no research that has looked at that. What were the gains? What is it that students learn? Perhaps not in literacy and mathematics, but in civic skills, in self-knowledge, in relationship skills as a result of having gone through this traumatic experience. Did it constrain the capacity and the progress of education systems? We know very little about that. We know very little. If we had been able to plot a rate of progress of education systems vis-a-vis their pre-existing priorities, what happened to that progress during the pandemic? Did it just stall it, or did in fact represent a real loss, a real regression of systems to earlier stages of development? Did it improve the capacity of education systems? And what impact did it have overall on the education agenda? So I think that there are three types of questions that we should be very interested in answering. One is exploring the systems that were resilient, understanding, identifying the innovations that took place during the pandemic, and examining their implications for the future, and then examining whether the pandemic in some systems stimulated educational transformation, new goals, new approaches. There are some countries, again, Finland, for example, in which the notion that that the education systems need to be blended, needs to be augmented with the capacity for digital learning and teaching is now a much greater priority than it was before the pandemic. And that is happening, to my knowledge, in some systems, but I don't know systematic research that has examined that response of education systems and how many of them are building back better because of the pandemic. So let me give you an example of what it would mean to look at the systems and the jurisdictions that didn't experience learning loss. So this is research conducted by some of my colleagues, part of this ongoing work examining the impact of the pandemic 3 years in, my colleagues in Brazil, Carlos Palacios and Bonamino, in which they looked at 10 states in Brazil for which there was data on literacy before and after the pandemic. And by after, I mean the year 2021. So let's say a year after the pandemic. And what you see in this chart is an average for the 10 states. It's an average of the percentage of students who are below the most basic level of literacy. They can't even recognize words, let alone meaning or anything like that. And what you see is that the percentage of kids below the most basic level of foundational literacy increased considerably during the pandemic, doubled. This research is confirmed by other studies in Brazil using different instruments and so on. However, when you look below the level of the state, you look at municipalities, you realize that these levels are very different. So these are the most recent data for 2021. And what you have here are two states, the state of Alagoas and the state of Pernambuco. And the municipalities that are here are high poverty municipalities. So in other words, these are not privileged kids. These are very poor kids with poverty rates that are equal or greater than the average for the state. But look at the darker line in the bottom is the percentage of students below the most basic level of literacy. So look at Alagoas, where that percentage is 78%. In other words, very similar to the average, right, for those 10 states. In the municipality of Coruripe, that percentage is less than half, 31%. And conversely, the percentage of students reading at the highest level of foundational literacy, these are kids in the second grade. These are children under the age of 7, first or second grade. That's 39% in that municipal network compared to 7% for the state. And the same is true in the municipality of Machados, in the state of Pernambuco. You see that whereas the overall percentage of kids who are unable to read at the most basic level is 76%, for Machados, that percentage is about half, 39%. And conversely, whereas for the state of Pernambuco, only 6% essentially have foundational literacy, in Machados, that's 37%. So I submit that we should be very interested in identifying outliers like these and in understanding what made them resilient. And the answer for these municipalities is very simple. And so this is another take. What you see here is that these municipal networks of Coruripe and Machados had been improving foundational literacy before the pandemic and had been improving it quite dramatically. Here you see Coruripe had a percentage of students who basically were reading at grade level where 68% in 2015, but that percentage had increased to 95% in 2017 and to 93% in 2019. And in the municipality of Machados in the state of Pernambuco, where the percentage of kids reading at grade level was 37%, that had increased to 83% in 2019. And so the question we should be trying to answer is why? What had these districts done that had caused such an improvement before the pandemic? And essentially what they had done were three very simple things. They had established a system of monitoring and supporting schools. where school supervisors visited schools periodically using highly structured protocols to assess student literacy and teacher instruction, and to provide coaching to the teachers on how to do a better job teaching foundational literacy. That's it, basically. They also had a system of assessment of literacy, and the results of that assessment were coupled with the professional development. And they had also implemented a program of tutoring for the students who were really, really behind in terms of foundational literacy. And these tutors were basically teachers in training or university students or retired teachers. Very much a measure that has been adopted to mitigate learning loss after the pandemic. These municipalities were doing these three simple things, and these three simple things had produced the gains that you have seen. And I think they had built systems that were resilient because they were able to essentially continue doing those things as soon as the schools reopen. So that's an example. That's an example of the kind of research that I think we should be doing, looking at the same data on learning loss where those are available or access, but not just at a national level, but at the state or provincial level, municipal level, and then looking at trends over time and examining what were the policies in place that had produced gains and that had produced higher than expected levels of performance, which are in effect one way to answer how to make resilient education systems. Now, I think we also should be looking at the innovations that were created during the pandemic, because should really surprise us is not that there was learning loss. Learning loss is what everybody expected in March of 2020. What should surprise us is that there was so much interest and effort to innovate in the midst of a pandemic in order to sustain educational opportunity. And so clearly the pandemic was a disruption of the regular functioning of schools and systems that suspended the normal rules of operation of the system. And as a result, created a blank slate, obviously in an emergency situation without sufficient resources, but where it was possible to try things that would not ordinarily be possible in terms, for example, of how teachers collaborated with each other, in terms of how civil society organizations participated, in terms of how parents were involved in education. And so I'm going to share with you two different studies that with my colleagues in the Global Initiative, we conducted of those innovations, again, in the early phase of the pandemic. One is a series of 45 case studies that we began to produce, I think at the end of April or May of 2020. And we produced 45 of them. They were published at the beginning of this year by the OCDE. And as we look across those case studies, we said, what do they have in common? What do these case studies? These case studies involve things from the creation of multimedia platforms by municipal education authorities or state education authorities or national education authorities, the use of WhatsApp to develop, to distribute content, the creation of technology-enabled systems to bring teachers and principals together for the purpose of jointly solving the challenges that the pandemic was creating, and so on. And subsequently, we conducted another study. This one was conducted between January of 2021 and August of 2021, looking at innovations that had some lasting power created during the pandemic through the lens of UNESCO's Futures of Education report, which I'll mention briefly. And I think the high-level findings of these two studies is that there was a lot of innovation aimed at supporting student-centered learning, which was a need predating the pandemic. There was relatively less innovation supporting deeper learning or higher order cognitive skills. There was a fair amount of attention to the social-emotional development and well-being of students. There was a lot of innovation in terms of how to create teacher and school principal communities of practice, and how to use technology for professional development. And there was a lot of innovation to optimize family engagement in learning. I want to mention this report of produced by the Commission on the Futures of Education convened by UNESCO, which we used as a lens to examine some of these innovations, because I think this report is an invitation for all of us to think about what is it that we need to reimagine in education. And as I think about the incomplete research agenda on the pandemic, it is incomplete because it doesn't address most of the ideas in this report. And the report basically says that in order to make sure that education systems provide an education that is relevant and aligned with the needs created by climate change, by democratic backsliding, by the challenges to human rights, by poverty and inequality, we're going to have to reimagine pedagogy, curriculum, the organization of schools, the teaching profession, and the creation of the learning ecosystem. And very little of the research that has been conducted to date on learning loss, or even the research that evaluates the fixes that have been put in place to remediate learning loss, actually advances this agenda very much, gives us knowledge that can advance this agenda very much. So let me conclude highlighting some of the risks that I foresee that are created both by the unaddressed needs of the pandemic, educational needs created by the pandemic, but also by the shortcomings of the research agenda. Certainly, we need to mitigate learning loss and continue to educate as the pandemic continues to linger. We also need urgently to address the mental health challenges which were triggered by the pandemic and the learning gaps caused by the pandemic. So I'm not just talking about learning loss, I'm talking about the increase in inequality here, prioritizing the poorest kids. Education systems really face the triple challenge of recovering what was lost, addressing the challenges predating the pandemic. In other words, we shouldn't take the baseline as a good system. The goal shouldn't be to restore the education system to the levels of functioning prior to the pandemic, because those were very deficient. This was known before the pandemic, and there were efforts underway to try to correct that. And then, most importantly, education systems need to continue to make progress in aligning their functioning to preparing students for the new challenges, economic and social challenges of the present. There is going to be financial austerity. There is in some places for governments as well as individuals. And there are burdens on existing staff exhausted from the efforts expended in sustaining education. But it is especially important to maintain high goals for schools and for systems. I think there is a serious risk of displacement of those ambitions that had gradually been building prior to the pandemic towards more basic goals of education. And so, what are the opportunities? Well, the opportunities are in examining the good things that happened during the pandemic, the greater emphasis on educating the whole child, the greater appreciation of the importance of science and technology, the greater appreciation of the use of technology for education, and as well as a greater understanding of our limitations in using this technology, the greater communication between schools and home that the pandemic made visible how important it was, a greater societal appreciation for the importance of education, the very many forms of collaboration among teachers and other stakeholders, and the reliance on partnership that the pandemic made possible. So those are the ideas I wanted to share with you as a way to set the stage for a conversation.
Thanks very much, Professor Reimers. If you have any questions for Professor Reimers, please type them in your Q&A box. So at this stage, I don't see any questions, but I have a question. So you mentioned in your presentation that there are these municipalities in Brazil that seem to be like positive deviances, but what they did actually were policies that are quite simple to do. It's basically any municipality can do these things if they want to. So the question I have is, do you know why a lot of the municipalities don't do these simple things? Is it because no financial capability, or they have little technical capability? Is it because the accountability is an issue, like they don't really care about learning outcomes? Or is it because of politics? Yes.
It's a very good question, Daniel, because I do think that in fact, what it takes to run a well-functioning system is probably something that was known before the pandemic. It requires things like those that those municipalities did, coherence, and sustaining those efforts over time. And so your question is, well, why isn't that normal? Why isn't that happening everywhere? Um, I haven't studied that issue to give you an answer, but given what I know, I certainly think that the lack of shared knowledge about these simple facts may be one of the reasons why it isn't done. So it is known to you and to others in this call that yes, assessing the level at which students are reading and providing teachers with actually specific feedback to teach better, and using and developing a more formative role for supervisors are good ideas. But this is not known to everyone. It's not known to every minister that I have encountered. It's not known to every politician, may not even be known to every parent. So I think there is an opportunity in identifying these simple kernels of knowledge of what constitutes a system and making sure that they become shared knowledge in a society so that we elevate the sophistication of the demand so that everybody expects these things to be part of what good education is. I don't think this, the creation of information systems certainly takes resources, and the development of a qualified cadre of supervisors that will be equipped to be effective pedagogical supervisors takes regulatory changes and investments in building that capacity and accountability. So I'm not suggesting by any means that these are free, but relative to the level of expenditures of most education systems, the cost of these interventions are really rounding errors. So I don't think the obstacle is financial or exclusively financial. It may be financial in the short term because some systems are so strapped with the wage bill that they have very little room to maneuver for improvements like that. But I'm sure that if you were to look at the efficiency gains that implementing these things would generate, the marginal cost of implementing these systems would be recovered in those efficient gains. I mean, we know how high levels of repetition and dropout are in many systems. And the impact of those things, grade after grade, is like the impact of compounding interest, right? A dropout of 5% every year will cause only half of the kids to finish school in the expected amount of time. So I think that is probably a combination, the answer to your question of why aren't these things happening, that this knowledge is not widely shared. So there is no social accountability to do that. And, and perhaps that there hasn't been enough impetus to professionalize education systems, to build them as professional entities. There may be some things involved in advancing the agenda of the futures of education of the Commission of UNESCO, which are not as simple as the ones I have described. For example, making sure that that teachers are selected and prepared as professionals and minimizing patronage and corruption in appointing teachers. That obviously is not a simple thing to do in many systems, even though it's a necessary thing to do. Um, you know, I find it very interesting that in some of the emerging studies, I'm aware of one in Mexico, that are looking at the effects of various efforts that have been attempted to recover learning loss, so tutoring, you find that there is no difference between the tutoring provided by trained teachers, by high school graduates, or by university students. And of course, that doesn't make any sense on the face. I mean, what it leads you to conclude is that anybody can teach. Now, that doesn't mean that anybody can teach. It means that the existing systems that we have in place to prepare teachers are probably not doing a great job adding much value between what any other university professional can do. So it's a probably a longer set of reforms that we need to professionalize systems. But that's precisely one of my points, that I am concerned that the pandemic may displace the efforts which were underway before the pandemic to do exactly that, and may induce a conservative bias where we're all so overwhelmed by the learning loss that we forget the reform agenda, the transformation agenda, and we become content with helping kids recover the levels of learning in literacy and mathematics and bring them to the levels before the pandemic. And that in effect is a diminution of the goals that were driving education systems before the pandemic.
Thank you very much, Professor Reimers. So we have a question from Shanti Jagannathan, who I believe is from the Asian Development Bank. So I will read her question. You rightly mentioned that the opportunity and readiness for policymakers to reimagine education and pursue innovation. To ensure that this sentiment sees the light of day, what type of enabling features may be helpful? Financial, non-financial, and intangible knowledge assets that may propel innovation for greater impact. In particular, I would like to know about possible impact on improved learning.
Possible impacts on what?
Improved learning.
Yeah, I do think that there has been a fair amount of innovation around the world. And I think the first step in capturing that is setting the goal of capturing it. That's why I'm advocating for broadening the research agenda on what happened to the pandemic beyond learning loss, which seems to become a growing obsession, particularly in the international development community, and expanding that in saying, let's actually capture the innovation that took place. There are a number of countries that have a national innovation agenda, and education is part of that national innovation agenda. And I think we have an opportunity to simply develop a good catalog of those innovations and a good analysis of what they produce to address the various levels of functioning of the education system, impact on access, impact on different modalities to learn, impact on new competencies. I'll give you an example. India, before the pandemic, had established 10,000 maker spaces as part of a huge innovation agenda in the country, where one of the goals was to develop computational thinking among low-income students. This, I think, is fundamental in the 21st century. This learning loss obsession is deviating us from that very important goal. Similarly, Uruguay, with Plan Ceibal, a national program to develop access to technology, has had for a number of years the goal of developing computational thinking, which they believe, as do I, that it's one of the literacies of the 21st century. We should be studying all these efforts to develop computational thinking and how successful they are, and how those have been advanced in the aftermath of the pandemic and what they are producing.
Okay, thank you, Professor Reimers. So Dean Sonobe has a question that you would like to ask live. Please go ahead, Dean Sonobe.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for the great presentation and also nice answers to the questions. Yeah, so it was really insightful and especially encouraging, especially in the second half about the innovations. It's really amazing to see such a large number of innovations took place in the middle of the very difficult times. And then, yeah, you introduced your book, Learning to Build Back Better Futures from UNESCO, and then the 31 innovations. These innovations are different from the technological innovation, but more like social or societal innovation, which would be more difficult to imitate. The beauty of innovation is usually said to be the possibility of diffusion, but in the case of this kind of innovation, it would be more difficult. But so the question is, how can we learn from those successful innovations? How can we push the diffusion?
You're quite right. I think the fact that all these innovations took place doesn't mean that we will be able to replicate them at scale in other settings. But I think the first step should be to make people aware of them. I'll give you an example. During the pandemic, many teachers had the opportunity, many of them for the first time, to be in communication with colleagues outside their schools for the purpose of jointly problem solving, solving problems that were new about how to teach, where they were not expecting their supervisors, the principals, to tell them how to solve a problem. They had to figure it out. And they use, some of them, very simple technologies to do that. So that happened on a rather large scale globally. I think it's very important that we document, just as I did with the example of Brazil, what were these two municipalities doing, that we document the many different ways in which these networks of teachers were created, and that we examine the types of problems that they dealt with and the solutions. And beginning with a catalog, I think we should encourage education authorities everywhere to animate further empowerment of teachers for an education transformation of systems that give greater autonomy to schools and to teaching personnel to solve problems of that sort, because not only to make systems more resilient to future crises, but because the very nature of our times require that teachers have such autonomy and such capacity to solve problems with the support of their peers. Now, is that a guarantee that a country like Indonesia, for example, if they simply disseminated this idea, they would be able to create these learning communities of teachers everywhere? Of course not. I mean, we know that Indonesia has been trying for 20 years to decentralize education and has faced tremendous challenges resulting from the lack of capacity at those decentralized levels. So we know that the problem of scale is a very severe problem in many places, in part because of the lack of institutional capacity and of human capacity at many levels of the system. But I do think the first step here in advancing an innovation agenda is to recognize the innovations that took place, to catalog and disseminate them, and then to try to engineer processes that can bring them to scale and to study them, basically run experiments with these innovations.
Yeah, I agree fully with you that knowing the facts that some others succeeded must be the first step, because it encourages. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Even though it's no guarantee that that we'll be able to replicate it. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So we have 1 more minute, and I have one more question in the Q&A. So Professor Reimers, if you can just answer this quickly, it would be great. So Yudanti Krishnasari asked, what are the things that are usually considered as a learning loss? Because he said different societies have different meaning.
Yeah,
In Indonesia, for example, they believe that if kids forget, to ask for permission to borrow something, which is like basic behavior that's required, or basic politeness, then that can also be considered as learning loss.
It's a wonderful question. So there are two common definitions of learning loss in education, which include, number one, on the competencies which are assessed, because that's the only thing we can talk about learning loss, for the same group of students, was there an actual decline before and after the event? And learning loss was actually studied before the pandemic for the summer period. It's called summer learning loss. It's a very well-established research that shows that during the summer, children lose the equivalent of a third of what they learn in the academic year. So we're talking about real loss, things that they knew the last day of the school year, which in September, when the new school year began, they had lost a third of that in the domains, typically the core academic domains. There is another definition of learning loss, which has been accepted in the pandemic, although I don't think it's the standard definition, which is really opportunity cost. It's not real loss. It's you compare two different cohorts of students in the same grade. Say you take students who are in the 4th grade in 2019, and you look at the levels of learning, and now you look at the current students in 4th grade. So obviously these were the students that spent grades 2 and 3 during the pandemic, and you look at their levels. So you're comparing different students, and if the performance is lower, you call that loss. Now, these students didn't really lose anything because they hadn't gained that knowledge, but what they lost was the opportunity to gain that knowledge. So that's why I mean that term is about opportunity cost, also in the domains of core academic skills. But I think that the question of Chris that is on the chat is a very good question, because we do know that many students, when they came back from social isolation, had lost the skills to function in a team. So I have not seen research that calls that learning loss, but I think we should consider that learning loss. It's not essentially the things that are, the only reason I think we haven't seen research is because we don't have any standardized instruments to measure kind of the readiness to learn, the social skills that make it possible to function in an environment. So I do know that in high poverty environments in Mexico and Brazil, children came back to school with displaying very high levels of violence against other students and against teachers. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The students were confined for a long time in environments in which there normally are very high levels of violence, which were aggravated because of the stresses caused by the pandemic, and they didn't have the breathing room, the respite, which schools normally provide when they're open for them to have a break from that stress, from that violence. They had been there 24/7 for 2 years. So they came back to school, and it's not just that they had forgotten how to follow directions from the teacher, is that they were using knives to stab other students or sometimes to attack the teacher. And I think we should also call that learning loss, following the question from the respondent, even though I haven't seen research that names that learning loss, but there is research that talks about these social challenges. That's what I meant by mental health challenges. I put that in the category of mental health when people lose the basic levels of self-regulation that allow them to function in a community. So I think you can consider those mental health or social emotional challenges, right?
Okay. Thank you very much for your answering all these questions. Unfortunately, we're over time, but I think it's been worth going over time. So thank you again, Professor Reimers, for spending the hour with us, and thank you to everyone who attended the talk. I hope you've learned something new, and see you again in our next feature speaker series.